First we will concentrate on systole, and out of systole we will concentrate on the first phase of systole, which is called isovolumic contraction. Isovolumic contraction starts with the QRS complex in ECG. With the QRS complex, we know the electrical activity goes through the ventricular myocardium and that induces ventricular contraction. With ventricular contraction, there is rapid rise in ventricular pressure. Now we will see what happens to the left ventricular pressure tracing. There is a sharp rise in left ventricular pressure tracing. This period gets its name isovolumic contraction because there is no change in the ventricular volume even though the ventricle starts to contract during this period. If you see the left ventricular volume curve, you can see that there is no change to the ventricular volume or left ventricular volume during this period. That is why it is called isovolumic contraction. So why doesn't the volume change when the ventricle contracts? At the very beginning of isovolumic contraction, when the left ventricular pressure goes above the left atrial pressure, the mitral valve closes, giving rise to the first heart sound. Left ventricle will continue to contract, but the pressure in the left ventricle is below the pressure in the aorta at this stage. So the aortic valve is also closed. So mitral valve is closed and the aortic valve is closed, and because of this, the ventricular volume remains the same even though there is a rapid rise in pressure in the left ventricle. That is why it is called isovolumic contraction. This period ends when LV pressure goes above the aortic pressure and aortic valve opens. Therefore, in this period between closure of mitral valve and opening of aortic valve, there is no inflow or outflow to the left ventricle because both valves are closed. Because of this, even though there is a rapid rise in pressure during this period, there is no change to the ventricular volume. So it is called isovolumic contraction. Now we will concentrate on left atrial pressure tracing to see what happens to the left atrial pressure tracing during this isovolumic contraction. With contraction of the ventricle, the closed mitral valve bulges into the left atrium. This causes the C wave or wave due to cusp bulging in the left atrial pressure tracing. If you look at the phonocardiogram of this cardiac cycle, you will see with closure of the mitral valve, you get the first heart sound. So the first heart sound coincides with closure of the mitral valve, which happens at the beginning of QRS complex. The next phase in cardiac cycle is called ejection or period of ejection. This is the period where blood gets ejected from the ventricle into the great vessel, right side from right ventricle to pulmonary artery and left side from left ventricle to aorta. If you concentrate on the left ventricular pressure tracing, you will see the rise in pressure continues until it reaches a peak somewhere in the middle of the period of ejection. After the peak, the left ventricular pressure gradually drops. If you concentrate on the aortic pressure tracing, you will see after opening of the aortic valve, the aortic pressure also rises along with the left ventricular pressure because blood gets ejected from the left ventricle to the aorta. So there is a similar rise in the aortic pressure until it reaches the peak pressure. This peak pressure is the pressure that we measure as systolic pressure when we check pressure invasively or non-invasively. If you carefully look at the peak pressure tracings, you will see that LV reaches its peak pressure slightly before the aorta reaches its peak pressure. If you analyze aortic pressure tracing and left ventricular pressure tracing, you can see the aortic pressure is slightly below the left ventricular pressure until it reaches the peak. But after the peak, aortic pressure remains slightly above the left ventricular pressure until the ejection period ends where the aortic valve closes. So how can you explain this phenomenon? This is called the period of ejection, and you know that blood continuously gets ejected from left ventricle to aorta during this period. But how can you eject blood from left ventricle to aorta when the left ventricular pressure is below the aortic pressure? This is the reason. At the beginning of the ventricular contraction, blood starts to move from left ventricle to aorta. So a momentum is generated in the volume of blood that gets ejected from left ventricle to aorta. Because of this momentum, blood continues to get ejected from left ventricle to aorta even after the peak where the left ventricular pressure is slightly below the aortic pressure. We will take a simple example to explain this phenomenon. You might have seen during bicycle races that people throw water at cyclists to cool them down. So when you throw water from the bucket, you move the bucket that contains water towards the cyclist with force. So at the end of this, you hold the bucket tight, so the bucket remains in your hand, but water moves towards the cyclist. So the same thing happens in the left ventricle when it ejects blood towards the aorta. So when blood continues to move from left ventricle to aorta during this period of ejection, the aortic wall stretches, but it can stretch up to a certain limit. So the pressure rises in the aorta, and due to recoil effect of the aorta, the aortic pressure rises and blood starts to move backwards towards the left ventricle. Because of this backward movement of blood towards the left ventricle, and to prevent blood in the aorta flowing back into the left ventricle, the aortic valve closes. So closure of aortic valve marks the end of the period of ejection. If you look at the aortic pressure tracing at this point, you will notice that there is a notch which is called dicrotic notch. This is also seen when you measure arterial blood pressure invasively through a arterial line. So what is the reason for this dicrotic notch? You might have seen the ripples that you get when you disturb a still mass of water. These ripples move out in a waveform. Similarly, in the aortic column of blood, when the aortic valve closes with a sudden jerk, there is a ripple generated. This ripple generated by closure of the aortic valve moves along the column of blood in the aorta. So when you measure the aortic pressure invasively, the dicrotic notch appears further down in the aortic pressure tracing if your cannula is further away from the aortic valve. Now we will concentrate on left ventricular volume and see what happens to left ventricular volume during this period of ejection. During this period of ejection, left ventricular volume gradually drops as blood gets ejected from left ventricle to aorta. At the end of ejection, it reaches its lowest point, which is called end systolic volume. If you concentrate on the left atrial pressure tracing, you will see that there is gradual rise in left atrial pressure due to pulmonary venous return into left atrium and systemic venous return into right atrium. If you analyze the ECG waveform, you will notice towards the end of ejection, there is T wave which indicates repolarization of the left ventricular myocardium. At the end of this period of ejection, you will see on phonocardiographic recording the appearance of second heart sound, which indicates closure of pulmonary and aortic valves. In summary, during this period of ejection, blood gets ejected from left ventricle to aorta, which leads to drop in left ventricular volume, which reaches its lowest volume, which is called end systolic volume, and at the end of ejection you hear the second heart sound, which is due to closure of aortic valve. This completes the systolic period in cardiac cycle. Next we will go through the diastolic period of cardiac cycle, which has 4 components. Out of that, first we will go through isovolumic relaxation. You have seen what happens during isovolumic contraction, and this period is called isovolumic relaxation. Again, isovolumic. Isovolumic means there is no change in volume or the ventricular volume. If you concentrate on the ECG waveform, you will see that T wave has already started at the latter part of ejection period. T wave is due to repolarization, which means ventricular relaxation. After closure of the aortic valve, which indicates the end of ejection period, the ventricle continues to relax. So the aortic valve is closed and it continues until the opening of mitral valve, which happens when the left ventricular pressure drops below the left atrial pressure. So the period between closure of the aortic valve to opening of mitral valve is called isovolumic relaxation period. Again, during this period, as both ventricular inflow and outflow are closed, even though there is a drop in ventricular pressure, the ventricular volume remains the same. If you concentrate on left ventricular volume tracing, you will see the left ventricular volume remains the same during this period. That is why it gets the name isovolumic. Now we will compare isovolumic relaxation to isovolumic contraction. These two echocardiographic images show the heart at isovolumic contraction and isovolumic relaxation. The first image shows the left ventricle at its maximum volume, which is called left ventricular end diastolic volume. That is the volume at the end of diastole. You get the maximum volume of left ventricle at this point because this is at the end of diastole, and during diastolic period the left ventricle gradually gets filled. So at the end of diastole you get the maximum volume in the left ventricle. The second image shows the left ventricle just before isovolumic relaxation, and you can see the left ventricle has reached its minimum volume, which is called left ventricular end systolic volume. As blood in the left ventricle gets pumped into the aorta during this period of ejection, at the end of ejection or just before the beginning of isovolumic relaxation, the left ventricle has its minimum volume because the blood in the left ventricle, most of it is already ejected into the aorta. So in between these two images, the ventricle has ejected blood into aorta. So the amount of blood that gets ejected into aorta is left ventricular end diastolic volume minus left ventricular end systolic volume, which is called the stroke volume. If you multiply the stroke volume by the heart rate, you get the cardiac output of that patient. If you concentrate on the atrial pressure tracing, you will see the atrial pressure reaches its peak at the end of isovolumic relaxation because atria continues to fill during this period of ventricular systole as well as isovolumic relaxation. This peak in atrial pressure tracing is called V wave to indicate venous return. This period of isovolumic relaxation ends with opening of the mitral valve. Mitral valve opens when the left ventricular pressure drops below the left atrial pressure. With the opening of mitral valve, blood starts to flow from left atrium to left ventricle. This is the beginning of left ventricular filling. So the next phase of cardiac cycle is called the rapid filling phase. Why is it called the rapid filling phase? Because at the beginning of this mitral valve opening or beginning of rapid filling phase, the left atrium has reached its maximum volume and pressure, and left ventricle has reached its minimum volume and pressure. So with opening of the mitral valve, there is a gush of blood from left atrium to left ventricle filling the left ventricle. That is why it is called rapid filling phase. If you concentrate on the left ventricular volume tracing, you will see during this period you get the maximum volume of blood moving from left atrium to left ventricle through the mitral valve. If there is any abnormal relaxation of the left ventricular myocardium, you will hear a third heart sound during this phase. Phonocardiographic image shows the appearance of third heart sound at the end of rapid filling phase. The next phase in diastole is called diastasis. Due to the initial rapid filling phase, the pressure in the left ventricle gradually rises. Because of this, the pressure difference between the left atrium and left ventricle is minimal during this period. Still, because of some pressure difference between the left atrium and left ventricle, blood slowly moves from left atrium to left ventricle during this period, continuing to fill the left ventricle. There is only a marginal rise of left ventricular volume during this period. At the end of diastasis, you will see the P wave on ECG waveform, which indicates atrial depolarization or atrial contraction. This takes the cardiac cycle to the next phase, which is called atrial contraction or atrial systole. This is the last part of our cardiac cycle. With the P wave, atria contracts due to depolarization of the atria. Up to this point, blood flow from left atrium to left ventricle was due to passive flow. With the P wave, there is active contraction of the atria, which pushes blood actively from the atrium to the ventricle. If you carefully look at the movement of mitral valve, you can see at the beginning of atrial systole, the mitral valve has already moved to the closing position. But with atrial systole, as there is a sudden rise in atrial pressure above the ventricular pressure, the atria pushes some more blood remaining in the atrium into the ventricle through the mitral valve, and this reopens the mitral valve. With this additional volume coming through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, left ventricular volume reaches its peak at the end of atrial systole, which is called left ventricular end diastolic volume. This is the maximum volume of blood that the ventricle can have at the end of diastole. This takes the cardiac cycle to the end of diastole, and the left ventricular pressure at the end of diastole is called left ventricular end diastolic pressure. If you concentrate on the ECG waveform at this point, you can see the beginning of QRS complex, which indicates the beginning of next cardiac cycle. So with this, we have completed the full cardiac cycle, and I think you have a good idea about isovolumic contraction, ejection, isovolumic relaxation, rapid filling phase, diastasis, and atrial systole, and how heart goes through a full cardiac cycle and all the events that happen in a single cardiac cycle. Before we conclude, I think it is better to have some idea about what happens in the atria, atrial pressure tracing and volume tracing. Atria also goes through a cycle of emptying and filling, or relaxation and contraction during this cardiac cycle. It happens in the background of ventricular activity. So we will see in isolation what happens to atrial pressure during a single cardiac cycle. With the P wave in ECG waveform, there is atrial depolarization and rise in atrial pressure due to atrial contraction. This is indicated as A wave in atrial waveform. A is to indicate atrial contraction. This A wave is seen during atrial systole. After A wave, you can see that there is a drop in atrial pressure. What causes this drop in atrial pressure? After atrial contraction, the atria starts to relax. During this period of atrial relaxation, there is venous return into atria. So one might expect that atrial pressure will gradually rise during this period. But you should note that ventricular contraction also happens during this period. With the ventricular contraction, the base of the heart or the AV valves are pulled towards the apex of the heart. This increases the volume of the atria. As this sudden increase in atrial volume is more than the volume of blood that comes through the venous return, the pressure in the atria gradually drops during this period, which leads to X descent seen in atrial pressure tracing. In this echocardiographic image, you can clearly see the movement of the base of the heart towards the apex during ventricular contraction, increasing the volume of atria. In the middle of this X descent, you see the C wave. During ventricular contraction, the AV valve bulges into the atria due to rise in ventricular pressure. This causes the C wave. We have already explained why we get the C wave. So this is the reason for the C wave seen in atrial pressure tracing. C stands for cusp bulging. After the X descent, you can see that there is a gradual rise in the pressure in the left atrial pressure tracing. This is due to constant venous return from the systemic and pulmonary veins into right and left atria. This rise in atrial pressure reaches a peak just before the opening of mitral valve. This peak is called the V wave to indicate venous return. At this point, the mitral valve opens and there is rapid flow of blood from atria to ventricle, reducing the pressure in the atria. This is indicated by the Y descent in the atrial pressure tracing. So this is how we get the AC and V waves and X and Y descents in atrial pressure tracing. So with this, we have completed an in-depth analysis of cardiac cycle. We have gone through all the waveforms in cardiac cycle and the different periods in cardiac cycle. We have seen how pressure and volume changes in different chambers in cardiac cycle and how ECG conducts all these changes and coordinates all these changes that happens in a cardiac cycle. We have also seen how we get the first and second heart sounds and also a third heart sound if there is impaired relaxation of ventricles. So in summary, we have seen that cardiac contraction and relaxation happens in an organized manner and there is constant change in pressure and volumes in different cardiac chambers. We have also seen how cardiac valves open and close during different phases of cardiac cycle, leading to heart sounds. A proper understanding of cardiac cycle helps in understanding any pathophysiological condition related to cardiovascular system. Therefore, it is very important that you go through this presentation and read related material to cardiac cycle over and over again and have a good understanding about cardiac cycle.